In this video, we're doing a deep dive into tomatoes, one of the most popular vegetables used in almost every cuisine around the world. But even though it's something we cook with and eat all the time, it's a food that most of us know very little about from a fundamental level. For example, the tomato originated in South America, then was domesticated in Mexico, and actually took a few hundred years before being commonly used in Italian cuisine. So how exactly did this tomato become popular all over the world? Secondly, from a flavor perspective, have you ever wondered if you can really tell a difference between all these varieties? Or what are the best tasting tomatoes for a BLT, tomato sauce, or salsa?
That one would be really good on a BLT. Wow, that's good.
Third, from a buying perspective, why do farmers market or homegrown tomatoes always seem to taste so much better than the grocery store ones? And lastly, many people say you should never refrigerate your tomatoes, but is that actually true? Well, we're going to answer all of that and much more. I purchased a bunch of different varieties of tomatoes and ran through several different taste tests so we can get to the bottom of this. And by the end of this video, I promise you will understand everything you need to know to get the most out of your tomatoes.
And to start, I have 5 tomatoes in front of me that I've never tried before. This is a red snapper tomato, a pink heirloom variety, a lemon boy, a green striped tomato, and a granadero, which is a type of Roma or plum tomato. So I'm gonna blindfold up and chop these and give them a taste test. So while I prep that, let's learn about how tomatoes are grown and some of these different varieties that are out there.
The tomato plant is one of many domesticated nightshades, and other common ones include potatoes, eggplants, and peppers. Most of us associate a nice, round, red ripe tomato, but there are hundreds of varieties of tomatoes in many shapes, sizes, and colors. From a taste perspective, the flesh is typically a mix of sweet, sour, and umami, though this varies wildly from tomato to tomato and also how that tomato is being prepared and eaten. Specifically, the tomato plant is part of the Lycopersicum esculentum nightshade family, and from a botanical perspective is actually a fruit. But we generally refer to fruits versus vegetables by their culinary uses, and in the case of the tomato, it is typically used alongside other savory ingredients inside salsas, pasta or pizza sauces, sandwiches, or salads. Additionally, from a legal perspective, at least in the US, tomatoes are considered a vegetable. In a decision by the Supreme Court of Nix versus Hedden in 1893, the court unanimously held that tomatoes should be classified as vegetables rather than fruits for purposes of tariffs, imports, and customs. Now today, we can't imagine life without tomatoes, whether fresh or processed in some way, but their popularity is kind of surprising and more of a recent trend in human history, unlike other ingredients we've covered on this channel, such as eggs, chicken, beef, and onions, which have all been staple ingredients for thousands of years. And in fact, the flavor of tomatoes that we love today was met with a lot of confusion and suspicion when it was first introduced to Europe. According to On Food and Cooking, tomatoes started out as small, bitter berries growing on bushes in the west coast deserts of South America. Today, after their domestication in Mexico, their name actually comes from the Aztec term for plump fruit, tomato, and a period of European suspicion that lasted into the 19th century, they're eaten all over the world in a great variety of sizes, shapes, and carotenoid painted colors. And this shows that even though we think of the tomato as synonymous with Italian food, on a macro scale, it wasn't part of the culture until much more recently. And one article mentions that the earliest known spaghetti in tomato sauce recipe was actually just dated from 1844. So this may make you wonder, why was the early tomato met with such suspicion? Well, the early tomato plants closely resembled a specific nightshade plant known as the deadly nightshade, and people didn't want to risk eating a tomato because they knew nightshades were toxic and produced highly bitter fruit. Today's tomatoes, though, are a domesticated version of this that over generations of selective cultivation don't produce the bitter alkaloids and toxins that the deadly nightshades have. And as you can imagine, it took a few hundred years for the Europeans to warm up to eating those tomatoes since they look so similar to toxic varieties of nightshades. And in Italy specifically, it turns out the Mediterranean climate and rich soils were ideal growing conditions for certain varieties of tomatoes, helping spread their popularity. So let's take a look at how tomatoes are grown and then start tasting some of these different varieties. Tomatoes are grown from seed into a vine-like or bush-like plant that can then yield a prolific harvest. And depending on the variety, some can be grown on the ground, while others need to be carefully pruned and trellised to maximize the yield and support the weight of the fruits to keep them off the ground for harvest and eating instead of reproduction. Now, tomato plant varieties typically fall into two categories: determinate and indeterminate. And instead of me explaining the differences, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin from Epic Gardening to show you.
I'm here in my backyard garden with two different rows of tomatoes. This row right here is my determinate row, or my bushing style tomato. And then over here, I have my indeterminate row, or my vining style tomatoes. So first, with the determinates, they're called that because they grow to a predetermined size based on the plant's genetics, usually about 6 or 7 feet. The final little bud is a flower bud, so it doesn't have the ability to grow any further. When that happens, they tend to bush out and send all their energy down to ripen most of the tomatoes within a tight window, about a month or so, which makes it really good for commercial cultivation and picking tomatoes all at the same time. But over here with my vining or indeterminate tomatoes, called that because the only thing that will get these tomatoes to stop growing is the season itself. When it gets too cold, they will start to die off, but otherwise they will grow indeterminately, sometimes up to even 20 feet long. The beauty of these is that although you do have to train them, trellis them, and prune them a little bit more deliberately, you get a reliable and consistent tomato production throughout the season, which makes it really great for a backyard gardener like myself.
Now, under normal outdoor conditions, tomatoes are a warm season crop that generally grows in the spring and summer. And because of this short season, tomatoes have historically been canned, dehydrated and sun-dried, or turned into a sauce and paste that can last throughout the several winter months. Modern farming, though, uses greenhouses or temperature-controlled hothouses to grow tomatoes year-round. And it's a pretty crazy innovation, both culturally and culinarily, to have fresh tomatoes that are available year-round instead of only having them available during the summer and then relying on canned products throughout the fall and winter. And this is why today, on a global level, the tomato industry is a big business. In 2022, the estimated total production was 186 million metric tons of tomatoes. Now, what was surprising to me is that the top two tomato-producing countries are India, with just over 20 million tons, though this does make sense because India has a large population and many of their dishes do start with tomatoes. But then you have China with over 3 times that amount at 68 million metric tons. So what's going on here? Well, while Chinese cuisine does have dishes with tomatoes in them, according to this article from tomatonews.com, China's tomato production has drastically increased in the past 10 to 15 years, primarily due to processing and exporting tomato paste. I'll leave a link to that whole article if you want to get the latest on tomato industry insights, but let's get back to growing. So usually, tomatoes are individually picked as they reach peak ripeness on the vine. Unfortunately, this isn't super practical for huge production farms, as ripe tomatoes end up being quite soft, and this causes two big issues. First, they'll get smashed and bruised during that picking, packing, and transportation process, or secondly, they'll over-ripen and spoil by the time they go through shipping, sit on the shelves, and finally get to the consumer. And these issues are what lead to some of these really big differences between the mass market tomatoes and the ones that you grow yourself or find at the farmer's market. As noted in On Food and Cooking, tomatoes that are allowed to ripen fully on the vine accumulate more sugar, acid, and aroma compounds and have the fullest flavor. So if you are growing your own tomatoes, you can literally take it from the garden straight to your plate in a couple of minutes. Or at a local farmer's market, they likely have picked their tomatoes that same morning or just a day or two before, where they are then immediately sold to market goers. However, in order to have mass-produced tomatoes year-round, most of the grocery store varieties are optimized for 1, a firmer texture so they hold up to the transport, a uniform size and color to appeal to shoppers, and lastly, a consistent flavor. Which, while the flavor is consistent from tomato to tomato, most of us in a side-by-side test with another farmer's market tomato will say, yeah, it's consistently worse. Now, one thing I was wondering is how do they get these tomatoes perfectly red looking, but still just lacking in flavor? Most commercially produced tomatoes today are grown in green or hothouses, which as shown in the shipping calendar can really be done all year round in North America. And this is why it is so common to see the term greenhouse or hothouse grown at the grocery store. Now, because of the shipping and transport time, a lot of these tomatoes grown in greenhouses or hothouses need to be picked before they actually get ripe on the vine. After transport and before going to the produce shelves, a lot of the prematurely picked tomatoes will then be exposed to ethylene gas in rooms until they change color and soften enough for selling. And this is the same process that happens with other climacteric fruits like bananas, apples, and avocado. And in general, this tactic has allowed for produce to be picked early and shipped before it is softened in the field, radically transforming the global produce shipping landscape. Now, not every tomato at the grocery store goes through this process. It does depend on the variety. Another common option you may see at the store are vine-ripened tomatoes or tomatoes sold still on the vine. And according to the USDA, vine-ripe tomatoes are harvested at a slightly riper stage and ripen fully without ethylene treatments. Quote, "The stem imparts a strong tomato smell that appeals to consumers as being an indicative of good flavor and freshness. These tomatoes also have a longer shelf life than beefsteak tomatoes since they are smaller and have a thicker skin." And greenhouse growers initially positioned TOVs in the marketplace as having superior taste. Today, there are typically several different varieties sold on the vine like this, and do they actually taste better? It kind of depends a lot. I mean, I think a little bit of that human element is going on here where like we see the vine, so we assume it tastes better. But if you do a side-by-side taste test with like an heirloom tomato or something like this, you'll realize these still taste quite a lot better. Ripening is one piece of the puzzle, but there's also another reason most commercial tomatoes end up lacking in flavor. As noted in this paper on chilling-induced tomato flavor loss, a major part of the problem is a post-harvest handling system that chills the fruit. Low-temperature storage is widely used to slow ripening and reduce decay of tomatoes. However, chilling results in the loss of flavor. Flavor-associated volatiles are sensitive to temperatures below 12 degrees Celsius, and their loss greatly reduces the flavor quality. Now, many people use this as justification that you should never refrigerate your tomatoes. But as I found out, that's not the case. Sometimes you should refrigerate your tomatoes, and other times they are better left on the counter. So how do you figure it out? By asking yourself a single common sense question. How ripe is your tomato? If the tomato is not yet ripe, go ahead and leave it on the counter until you are ready to eat it. And this is what I would recommend for most mass-produced tomatoes. In general, we can perceive more aroma and taste with a room temperature tomato compared to a cold one. However, if your tomato is already perfectly ripe, you've got two options. Obviously, number one, eat it and enjoy it right away. Now, if you have some very ripe tomatoes that you grew or bought at a farmer's market and leave it out for an extra day or two, they can literally go soft and mushy in just that time. Now I need to throw out half of this tomato. Instead, I should have used option 2. Store it in the fridge and bring it to room temperature for eating. And this made me wonder, could I actually tell a difference in two tomatoes that are the same temperature at eating, but one of them have been refrigerated? Well, I put it to the test. For this BLT test, I took the same variety of tomato at equal ripenesses and added one to the fridge for 26 hours. The other, I just left out on the counter. When I was ready to make the BLT, I took it out of the fridge and set it outside for 20 minutes to raise it back to 70 degrees Fahrenheit before making my perfect BLT, which I'm kind of particular about. It starts with potato bread with a very thin slathering of mayo. Then I add a cracker-thin crispy bacon layer, light butter crunch lettuce, and a thick 1/2 inch slice of tomato before adding the other top piece of bread.
This right here is my ideal BLT, and I'm so excited for this taste test. So 2 were made with the refrigerated and then reheated, which again did have a slightly firmer texture. I noticed that when I was kind of feeling them, but let's see if I actually can blindfold up and tell a difference between them. So let's go. Give me that juicy bite. Soft white bread, mayo, cracker thin bacon, and just a juicy tomato with a little lettuce. Wow. Number 2. Dude, oh my God. I'm literally gonna eat both of these. Really, really good on that one too. Like, I don't even know if these two are different. I like, potentially those were slightly different in tanginess, but just both amazing still. So Nothing really going on. Let's go to number 3. The thing that's tough about this taste test is it's kind of tomato forward when you bite in, but then the bacon is kind of what lingers around. So it is kind of hard to tell a difference between any of them. I'm not really getting much difference here. I would maybe wager 2 and 3 might be the same and 1 is different, but no idea. And no. Sorry, I gotta finish these real quick. I'm starving. So I know many people often bring up that you shouldn't refrigerate tomatoes, but I think what matters a lot more is picking a variety you really, really like, make sure that variety is ripe and in season, and then if you do need to throw it in the fridge for a day or two, bring it out, bring it up to room temperature if you don't like cold tomatoes, but for me personally, not something I would really be worried about. These are really delicious either way.
Okay, so we understand the history of tomatoes, how they are grown, some of the common terms in modern production, and whether you should refrigerate them or not. But for the rest of this video, we've got 3 things to talk about. 1, what are the 3 broad categories of tomatoes you can buy? 2, what is the flavor of tomatoes from a chemical composition perspective? And lastly, how do tomatoes change flavor when they are cooked? So, in terms of culinary usage, there are 3 main categories of tomatoes. First is slicers. This is used to refer to large varieties of tomatoes like beefsteak, big boy, or many of those heirloom varieties. Secondly, we have sauce tomatoes. These typically refer to plum tomato varieties like San Marzano, Roma, and Amish paste, which have a little bit less moisture and more of the tomato flesh. And then third, we have snacking tomatoes. Typically, these refer to small tomato varieties like cherry, great, Campari, or Sungolds. Now, these are a very loose category with tons of variety, and there are no rules here. You can use slicers to make a tomato sauce, use a Roma tomato for your sandwiches. The important thing here is to find tomatoes that you actually enjoy the flavor of. And one of the best ways to do that is with the blind taste test I introduced at the beginning of this video. So in this test, I have 4 slicer varieties that are also all different heirloom varieties that I bought from my local farmer's market. Then I have 1 sauce tomato, the Granadero, so let's see how they taste side by side.
I always like to blindfold up when doing these. Obviously, I've never tried these, so I'm not trying to guess which is which. I'm just trying to give you some of my observations here. Whoa, that first one is amazing. Juicy, tangy, with a little bit of sweetness. That one would be really good on a BLT to pair with bacon. Wow, that's good. Man, that first one's hitting for me. All right, let's go to number 2. So I know that's the Roma, just based on the texture. Less juicy for sure. Kind of a more green taste to it as well. Let's go to number 3. Whoa, okay. Definitely more sour and tangy on that one. I would love that in kind of maybe a salad dressing or something. To eat alone, 1 still, I love number 1. Number 4. I'd say 3 and 4 are more similar to each other than number 1. A little bit more on the tangy side. Solid, but not my favorite. All right, number 5. Water and juices level, very similar to number 1. Taste though, more on the sour side, that would say less sweet. Kind of reminds me of something like a tomato I think I'd want on like an Italian hoagie. It's really very interesting to compare and contrast the differences between these though. Let's see what we got. Okay, interesting. So I would say these 3 varieties are definitely more on the sour side. And then in terms of juiciness, you can totally feel like the burst. I think this green striped tomato, I forget exactly what it is the most balanced for me. Like the sweet and sour is nice and balanced. Yeah, but highly recommend giving this a shot if you're out of the farmer's market. It's really cool to compare and contrast. I think for me, what really separated this one was the balance between the sweetness and the sourness. Where these were a little bit more sour forward, That being said, I think what you really need to figure out with tomatoes is when to use certain types for certain occasions.
So what did we learn from this test? Well, first, in raw applications, I really prefer a tomato with a balance of sweet and sour. And secondly, raw tomatoes do not have strong aroma differences between them. And this is really important because it kind of explains why tomatoes are so useful and have become popular in basically every cuisine around the world. When we cook with tomatoes, we are primarily using them for their sour, sweet, and umami taste. But then we add a variety of aromatic ingredients to make our food more interesting. For example, in a pasta puttanesca, we add garlic, anchovies, and olives to our tomatoes. For a Pakistani chicken karahi, we use garlic, ginger, and a bunch of spices with our tomatoes. Or for a picadillo, the aromatic ingredients are garlic, onion, smoked paprika, and chili powder. And as a reminder, at a high level, these 6 properties make up the flavor of food: taste, aroma, texture, sight, physical, and the human element. And we have a breakdown of all these on my website Cookwell if you want some additional reading. But now I know you're probably wondering one thing. From a chemical perspective, what is in these tomatoes that causes them to be sweet, sour, and umami? And why can some tomato varieties end up being so much sweeter than each other? So let's take a look at the 4 parts of the tomato. On the outside, we have the skin, and this includes a unique mix of carotenoids that provide the color, and lycopene is the main pigment that provides the red color. The skin also provides plenty of structure and texture. Moving inside, we have the fruit wall, and this is rich in sugars and amino acids. Glucose and fructose lend to the sweet taste, malic and citric acid provide the sour, and glutamic acid provides umami. The inner tomato jelly is mostly water, but will have some sugar balancing acids, and then the inner pith is fairly neutral, but could be a little bit bitter too if eaten alone. And obviously, every tomato variety has different amounts. So that green-red heirloom that I really enjoyed likely had a higher proportion of glucose and fructose compared to the malic and citric acid. The malic and citric acid, though, was likely much higher in that lemon boy variety, which I pointed out as sour in a side-by-side test. So knowing this context, I wanted to do another test. I always see these flavor bomb sweet cherry tomatoes, but do these actually taste fairly different, or is this just a marketing term?
So I've got 3 varieties here. These are some kind of pure multicolored one. These are like a baby San Marzano. And then these are kind of those sweet on the vine cherry tomatoes. What I'm gonna do is just blindfold up and see if there are noticeable differences here between any of them. And I'm not trying to guess, I just like to blindfold to focus really on the taste. Good. I feel like that one's a nice balance of sour and sweet. So this one. Compared to that first one, like no sweetness, no sourness, this one tastes super plain comparatively. Yeah, that's weird. Number 3. Whoa, these are good. You kind of do get a little of the smell of like the vine that it was on. Those are really, really good too. These to me are a little bit more tart. I feel like my tongue is really watering, which is nice. And then these are definitely a little bit more sweeter, which I would probably want to use if I was cooking these down to in a sauce. And then surprisingly, this kind of San Marzano variety just really doesn't taste like much of anything. And in conclusion for this test, I would definitely recommend trying out a couple different varieties of these snacking tomatoes. You can clearly tell some differences between them.
Okay, so we understand the loose categories of tomatoes and the flavor differences between them raw, but what happens to tomatoes when they're cooked? When we cook tomatoes down in a sauce, a lot of that free water is evaporated off, leading us to a nice thick sauce, and there are 2 big changes happening. First, we are significantly concentrating the glucose and fructose, the malic and citric acid, and the glutamic acid. And secondly, we are creating new aromas by various reactions happening. And this is why tomato-based products taste so much different than raw ones. For example, in sun-dried tomatoes, they are very concentrated because most of that water has evaporated off, or a small can of tomato paste was likely made from several individual tomatoes. Now, in one final test, I wanted to see if I could tell a difference between an organic and a standard Roma tomato sauce. So for this, I added 500 grams of each tomato along with a sprinkle of salt and 20 grams of olive oil, tossed it into the oven at 250 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 hours, then just brought those over and poured them into a blender. Now, while these are the same variety of tomato, tomatoes with the organic label are grown according to the USDA organic guidelines, meaning natural intervention, restricted pesticide use, better soil, and product regulations. Keep in mind, though, that producers do have to pay for the USDA to come and inspect and certify them as organic. So a small farmer who is producing incredible tomatoes may not choose to be labeled as organic. And this is what happened when I bought the tomatoes at the farmer's market. Someone actually asked in line, like, are these organic tomatoes? And he goes, I mean, they would probably pass, but we don't actually pay for them to get organic certified. So technically they're not. Now, when raw, the organic Roma tomatoes just look and taste riper to me. But what happens when they are cooked down and concentrated in this sauce?
So can you taste the difference between an organic tomato puree and a standard one? Let's blindfold up and give them a test. I will say the standard Roma, which again did look a little less ripe, just looks marginally lighter in color as well. Oh, just spilled. I do have the coffee cupping spoon. I'll save you the slurping noises though. Ooh, really good. Also, I will say this is a great thing to do during the summer with extra tomatoes. You can turn this into pizza sauce, pasta sauce, roasted salsas, just by depending on what spices and things you add to this. First one, good tasting. Oh, was that different? I'm not sure. Nothing's leaping off the page. Let me go back through though. Spilling sauce everywhere. Nothing left off the page from me here. If I had to guess, I would say 1 and 2 are the same and 3 are different. So 1 and 2 are the same and 3 is different. So I wasn't exactly sure why, but 1 and 2 just tasted a little more tart to me, a little more sour. Whereas 3 was definitely a little bit more rounded. So was I able to tell the difference between an organic and a standard Roma tomato? Yes, but let me point out a couple of caveats.
You gotta keep in mind from a flavor perspective, first, these did look different in terms of ripeness, and I could have maybe changed that if I had waited a day or two. Secondly, these were not drastically different, and I could have adjusted the sauces. I could have tried cooking them down longer, adding a little sugar or honey to sweeten them, but then people would also argue the point of buying better tasting ingredients is that you don't need to do anything to them. Now, we've covered a lot of stuff in this video, but one thing we haven't talked about really at all is canned tomatoes. And that is because I have done a whole separate video on that. But even if you've seen it, I would highly recommend going back for the rewatch. It makes a lot more sense now, especially now that we do have the context from this video. But to round this video out, here's how I would recommend buying tomatoes throughout the year. Depending on where you are in the US at least, from June to September is your peak tomato season. Go buy and try as many different varieties at your farmer's market or grow them yourself. It is so much fun just tasting them side by side and figuring out for yourself what tomatoes you like the best. Some of my favorite meals to make are BLTs obviously, pasta alla cecca, panzanella salad, and one of my favorite 4-ingredient breakfast sandwiches is literally just an English muffin from a bakery, crisp up, add a spread of cream cheese, some crispy bacon, and a thick piece of tomato. I could eat that every day during the summer. So take advantage of peak tomato season while you can, but then here are the 3 things that I do from October to May. If I need fresh tomatoes for a salad, a rice bowl, or kind of quick meals like that, I'll typically stick to snacking varieties, and in this video, I found out I did really like those sweet ones the most. Secondly, if I do want a sandwich, I will just buy a grocery store slicer tomato and accept that it's not going to be great. For sauces, I'll stick to whole peeled canned tomatoes or sometimes fresh cherry tomatoes, and specifically, I like to look for cans with tomato puree in them. Also, I did just find some canned cherry tomatoes that I think I'm gonna do a side-by-side blind taste test on the second channel if you want to go ahead and subscribe. But anyway, that will wrap it up for this video. I hope you now understand what are the differences between all these varieties of tomatoes, why farmers market or homegrown tomatoes typically taste so much better than commercial ones, and a little bit of that tomato history. So go out in the world, try as many tomatoes as you can this summer. Let me know what you make down in the comments, but that will wrap it up for me in this one. I will catch you all in the next one. Peace, y'all.